ending August 29th, 1968. More than 650 people were arrested, more than 1,100 injured.
It wasn't until Nixon was inaugurated that a great deal of activity occurred, and I think that clearly this has been his decision.
You know, we live in a very silly society. We live in a society where more young people know the words to We Are the World than they know to what country the food is going in Africa. So,
Mr. Hart, how do you account for the fact that the shanties are going up in about 7 colleges through the East and even in Stanford in California and elsewhere in California? Is that part of the reactionary group, the new conservatives?
In my opinion, this whole so-called spontaneous uprising in favor of disinvestment in South Africa is a vestige of the old liberal left-wing organizations that are still in force on the campuses. At Dartmouth, about 150...
Well, I thought you said that the new right was in force.
At Dartmouth, about 150 kids were involved in the disinvestment cause, out of a student population of about 4,000. Everybody's against racial discrimination and apartheid in South Africa. The question is, what do you do to solve these things? Do you do it by closing down the economy, by closing down economic opportunity to black people, or do you do it by expanding the economy?
Mr. Hoffman, the war in Vietnam was going 12 years before anyone paid any attention to it. It was much the stage in 1963 as we are in Central America today, and it was as difficult to explain it to the American public.
I'm trying to find out what it is about the new right, which...
Well, I'm not new right.
Well, all right, whatever you call that magazine, the conservative...
I'm not old left.
What is it that makes it rude? I mean, why do you have to, for example, at Dartmouth, why do you have to invade a homosexual society and secretly tape its meetings and report it in the newspaper to the terrible embarrassment of your fellow students?
The meeting was a publicly advertised event.
Yes, but...
We sent a reporter who turned on a tape recorder, the equivalent of taking notes, and she wrote a story about it.
Come on.
This meeting was advertised.
Yep,
it was
advertised as a meeting of the club. It was not supposed to be invaded by a reporter. And the reporter was there under
If there's posters up all over school...
No, I'm asking you, why do you have to be rude? Why do you have to make fun of the blacks at Dartmouth? Why do you have to make fun of the women?
Yeah, they weren't making fun of the blacks. They were making fun of the ridiculous affirmative action.
Exactly.
Can't you see? I mean, you can't see the humor.
We're making fun of liberal.
No, I don't think I see the humor. I don't think. Wait a minute.
The whole purpose of the review.
Black students don't see the humor in it.
You have blacks on the Dartmouth Review.
We've had many blacks on the Dartmouth Review. We've been called racist. We've had about a third of the staff has been Jewish. We've been called anti-Semitic. We've had 2 female editor-in-chiefs. We've been called anti-woman.
Okay.
The fact is that these words racist, anti-Semite, warmonger...
Tom, I'm really afraid that you're going to have trouble ever again calling yourself a liberal, because you tonight were about as liberal as Benito Mussolini.
So guys, I've really been looking forward to this. An old friend of mine, a Dartmouth friend of mine, somebody who actually met me when I was just a freshman at Dartmouth, Ben Hart. Ben, you were a senior when I was a freshman, and I thought it'd be really fun for us to join on the podcast and talk about the old days, talk about the Dartmouth Review, the renegade campus newspaper that we were both part of, but also talk about Reagan conservatism and Trump conservatism. But let's begin kind of at the beginning, which is we met through this new student paper that you actually were one of the... I wasn't a founder, but I joined right at the beginning. So start by telling the story of how you got the idea for starting this rebel right-wing paper.
Yeah, well, it's called the Dartmouth Review, and it's probably the most famous of the student conservative newspapers that really have ever existed. It was one of the first, maybe the first, maybe not the first, but certainly the most famous of the student conservative newspapers that sprang up at that time. In fact, after the Dartmouth Review was started, more than 100 other conservative student newspapers started kind of in the wake of the Dartmouth Review, because the Dartmouth Review was getting a lot of attention. 60 Minutes did a piece on the Dartmouth Review, New York Times, Time Magazine. I debated Abbie Hoffman on CNN's Crossfire,
the old 60s
radical. So it had a great sort of start in tradition, and a lot of great talent really came out of the Dartmouth Review. Laura Ingram was also joined the paper as a freshman. I met Laura her freshman year. She came into the offices of the Review, and she said, I'm here to work on the Dartmouth Review. That's why I came to Dartmouth. And she was dressed like in a snowsuit or something. Like she was dressed in like galoshes that were, sort of open and, hat on. And she walked into the office, and that's how I met Laura. But I met you, Dinesh. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say when I first joined the Review, as you know, I actually wasn't all that political.
Right.
And in fact, shortly thereafter, when I was nominated to be the editor of the Dartmouth Review, you were strongly opposed because, well, you tell why.
I'll tell a little bit. Yeah, just a little bit of a backstory. I don't know how much detail we want to go into, but anyway, the editor of the paper, the founding editor of the paper, was a guy named Greg Fossetall, very talented guy, terrific writer. And I was on the business side. I was the publisher, president. I didn't have any kind of journalism background. Had not worked on the regular daily paper. Dinesh, you worked on the Daily Dartmouth, which was the regular paper. And Greg Fossetall was the editor-in-chief of that paper. Right. But he got fired by the paper for writing a conservative editorial. We can get into that a little bit too, because that was really part of the genesis of the paper. I wanted to start the Dartmouth Review. I wanted to start a conservative student newspaper for a number of years, but I didn't have any experience as in journalism. I hadn't worked on the paper. So when Greg got fired as editor of as a regular Dartmouth, I saw that as a terrific opportunity to launch this paper. Recruited Greg, Greg and I talked about it, and we wanted to launch this paper. And he wanted to bring you on board because you were writing a lot of great investigative stuff for the Daily Dartmouth. But you weren't very political, and you weren't that sure if you wanted to join the paper. But you had some problems with the paper because it was a conservative paper.
And it was kind of a bomb-throwing.
It was a bomb-throwing paper, right? Well, it was supposed to be sort of a conservative National Lampoon, or at least half of it was sort of National Lampoon, and half of it was just commentary about what was going on the campus, but mostly reporting. But we needed you because you were a very good reporter.
Well, but at the beginning, I was suspect.
Yeah, let me, a little background on Dinesh. I hope you don't mind.
No, I don't mind.
So Dinesh came to the paper. He was kind of critical, uncomfortable with just it being a conservative newspaper. And Greg really wanted to bring Dinesh on, the founding editor, because he wanted Dinesh's investigative reporting. So I thought that was great. Dinesh would do his investigative pieces. And but Dinesh apparently there was a secret condition that he would be allowed to publish an article in the paper called Reviewing the Review, where he would critique the review and complain about the review.
Reviewing the review.
Reviewing the review. I'll never forget it. So Greg and I had finalized I think it was the second issue of the paper. It was one of the early issues, at the very beginning. So I was very proud of this paper that we had just laid out. I'd gotten back from the printer. It looked great. I think Greg and I had gotten back. But it hadn't been printed yet. So it got printed, and then the paper arrived. And
remember, we would hand deliver the paper to all the dorms, to every dorm room door.
So I get my paper, and I'm in bed. I open it up, and on the front page is Dinesh's article, reviewing the review, trashing the review. so I was really steamed. I mean, I was so angry about it. I get on the phone with Greg, and I'm like, what is going on here? This wasn't the paper that we had approved. So, he explained that the condition of Dinesh working for the paper, that he would be allowed to write this article. so that's what happened. So anyway, but Dinesh then became, I guess, adopted it became conservative. Dinesh, why don't you talk a little bit about that? Like, what was it that moved you from being kind of just neutral, more or less, and then?
Well, I won't say off the boat. I'd been in America for a year, and I came to Dartmouth, and of course I wanted to learn what it's like to be, an Ivy League kid and what books I should read. And so when the idea of the review came along, I thought, wow, this is a place for me to kind of spread my wings and write ideas. But, I think what had happened, and this is an important point about liberalism, if you're not actively conservative, you're pulled by the liberal tide. Right. And I think I was infected to that degree with certain elements of liberalism. And so I found the review initially too conservative, too right-wing, too extreme. Right. And that was the nature of my critique. So, I think for me, Ben, there was two things. One is I I was drawn into the intellectual world of the review. You guys were talking about books and ideas I'd never heard of. And I was like, wow, how do they have answers when I don't even know that these were questions?
George Orwell's 1984 and stuff. Yeah.
Solzhenitsyn,
Yeah,
Hayek.
Solzhenitsyn, yep.
And, but the second thing was the extreme reaction of the college. As soon as the paper came out, as you know, we got a letter from the college basically saying, cease and desist from using the name Dartmouth. Here was the college exercising this authority over its own students who were writing about the campus for the alumni. I mean, I just found that so outrageous that we saw even then the intolerance of the left, the fact that they didn't want this kind of dissent. And I think what made them particularly dangerous was that this newspaper was independent. Talk a little bit about why you decided early on that the paper should have no affiliation with the college, but should operate, raise its own money, and function independently.
Well, I mean, it could not be affiliated with the college because the college was pretty much defunding, not funding at all, conservative groups. You know, so if you were a conservative group and applied for student funding, you would not get funding.
Right.
You couldn't. If you were the Gay Students Association funding, if you were, any kind of liberal organization, you'd get funding. But there's no chance that the Dartmouth Review is going to get funding. So the other issue was that we wanted to go out to the alumni and be an alternative to the alumni magazine, because the alumni magazine is basically a fundraising piece. It's to go out to the alumni and paint the rosy picture of Dartmouth, but without really saying what's going on the campus. And the whole strength of the Dartmouth Review, and one of our rules was we could only write about Dartmouth. Students didn't know enough about national politics or economics to really write about national issues, and people could get that information other places, reading National Review or whatever. But what they couldn't get was information about what was going on in the Dartmouth campus. And so that was our rule, that the students had to write about issues that were affecting the campus, that what was going on the campus, that did have a broader national implication. But in terms of the alumni, it was eye-opening to the alumni. And the other reason that Dartmouth really hated the Dartmouth Review was that we were going out to the Dartmouth alumni. There was an alumni directory. Another source of the legal problem for us was that we were using the alumni directory to build a mailing list to send this paper free to every single Dartmouth alumnus, all 40-something thousand, and that just freaked out the college.
Ben wrote a great book called Poison Ivy that chronicles our days at Dartmouth together. And in your book, Poison Ivy, you describe something that you called the ethos. Say what the ethos was then, and how does it relate to what's happening now?
Right. So at Dartmouth at that time, there was kind of the, I would say, the germ of the whole woke ideology that we see today. And it was in what we call the victim studies departments that were starting to spring up at that time on campuses across the country, particularly in the Ivy League.
So let's explain what that means. So you've got the English department, the history department. The way that the left burrowed its way in is they weren't able to take over the English department. So what they did was they started the women's studies department and the black studies department. I don't think there was a gay studies department. There was a Native American studies department. So these were the enclaves of radicalism.
Exactly.
But this was actually not, and this is an important point, this was not the mainstream history professor. So talk about who...
Well, let me just talk a little bit about this whole ethos thing. Yeah. The whole thing about ethos, what I call the ethos, which now would be like maybe critical race theory or woke ideology, is it's not just about political positions. It's about, you have to have an attitude about everything, all aspects of life. It's about what clothing you wear. It's about what food you eat. It's virtue signaling everywhere. And so that really started in these what I call victim studies departments. That whole critical race theory was present back then. Nobody took it seriously on the campus. The students didn't take it seriously, but these ideas were germinating in these radical departments, these specialized departments, which were very different from like the English literature department or the history department, where you had liberal professors, but they were more sort of, I would call, John F. Kennedy type liberals or New Deal style, old style liberals. They weren't radicals. And I'll give you one example. We had a great professor, very much a Democrat, very much opposed to the Dartmouth Review, named Jim Cox, and I took his courses. He was one of the nation's experts on Mark Twain. I took his course on Twain. Of course, Mark Twain is basically banned from the library today. Banned.
The N-word appears in Huckleberry Finn.
Even though the whole point of Twain is anti-racism, but because it's not using the proper language, it's banned. So someone like Jim Cox, who did not like the newspaper, didn't agree with us at all, he would be canceled today just for being a Mark Twain scholar.
And he loved Mark Twain, and he would never have been on board with the idea that you shouldn't read Moby Dick, or you shouldn't read The Scarlet Letter.
And he was a great professor. I got good grades with him. I never got, even though we disagreed politically, you know, he was a Democrat, I was a Republican, but I never had any problems with grades from a lot of these professors that were in these traditional departments. They were Democrats, didn't agree with the paper, but they stuck to the material. They didn't bring politics into their classes.
Fair to say that the radicalism represented by Professor Cole, Marissa Navarro, you remember the Women's Studies
I forgot
Department?
about her. Yeah, she was like the champion of the wokeness back then.
Totally. And I mean, these are people who wanted to shut down the fraternities. They were they hated us.
You're right.
I remember Marissa Navarro, she would say things like she didn't like to walk across the Dartmouth campus because the huge towering Baker Tower reminded her of a phallic symbol.
Right.
So it disturbed her
so she was
to actually walk on the campus.
She was on the cutting edge.
She was on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure she's really mad that she didn't come up with like intersectionality, and nobody uses her name today.
Yeah.
But all this stuff that was crazy then and on the margin. Now, how did it become mainstream? Did it become mainstream because the liberals, people like Professor Cox, even though they knew it was nonsense, they were too invertebrate to stand up against it? What happened?
He was a Democrat, but I would apply that more to the administration, which did have Republicans running the administration. Remember, the president of Dartmouth was a Republican, David McLaughlin, a business guy, successful in business. But he totally caved to the woke ideology because he just didn't know how to kind of intellectually deal with it. So his reaction was to just cave. And so in a way, he was worse than the previous president, who was also very liberal, but at least he was serious. John Kemeny was a very serious mathematician. He was actually Einstein's math guy, because Einstein made math mistakes, and John Kemeny was a mathematician, and he corrected Einstein's math. And so that's how smart. So, but Kemeny was not really suited also to be a president because he was a mathematician, an intellectual, and so he was also getting kind of steamrolled by this woke stuff.
Well, he was steamrolled because he was, in a sense, in the sciences, and so he didn't even know what these people were talking about. He had no idea. And I'm sure if you went to him and said things like math is racist, and 2 plus 2 equals 4, or you want ethnomathematics to replace.
I think he invented or wrote basic computer language. So he built the Kiewit Computer Center, which is one of the really pioneering. So we had a lot of serious intellectual firepower at Dartmouth. But it did get infected with this woke stuff coming out of the victim studies academic departments, which were small, but they were influential.